I'm excited about this story. This story was so dense. There's like never been so much. I think because it's so old, maybe, but there's never been so many like different accounts for what happened. I think it's because like it's so dramatized over the years, and what actually happened was kind of, it's overall just kind of sad. But then I think that with all the movies that came out, you know about Bonnie and Clyde, right, Danielle?
Yes.
Yeah. So I actually didn't know much about them, other than like the way that, you know, they had been portrayed. There was like Halloween costumes about these people. That's a couple Halloween costumes that I always see. But like, I knew that they were bank robbers. I knew that had this life of crime, and that and I knew about how they died in this, like, they died together and they were in love. But yeah, a lot of it seems to be dramatized. So if to those of the audience, this might be more factual, which might take away the excitement of it. But from what I gathered, and there was a lot of different accounts, I tried to make sure to get most of the information from, like FBI.gov, and like things that were accurate and not take away from the movies, or even some of the documentaries went a little off the rails about the love part of it. And I think also part of that too was that Bonnie, she wrote a lot of poetry, and they took like the poetry and they kind of wind it in with the story, and it makes it so much more glamorous, and like, it's you and me against the world, kid. That's kind of how it seems. So taking all that in, and then going into the facts of it, they were mostly just criminals, really. But so I'm going to dive into Bonnie first, and how she came to be. Bonnie, she was born in Rowena, Texas, which was a farm town, and she was born on October 1st in 1910. Her dad was Charles Barker. He was a brick mason. So her family was considered a higher social class, and her mother specifically was kind of obsessed with being known for being this higher social class. She really pushed that on her kids, and she was a really proud woman, and so she liked showing off her family a lot. When they went to church, they went to a Baptist church, and Bonnie had two siblings. She had a brother named Hubert, and she had a younger sister named Billie Jean. Her mother, like I mentioned, was a very proud woman, and she was kind of ironic in the sense that her mother named Emma. She would bring the family to church every Sunday and make sure that they were, acting correctly. They weren't allowed to curse. They were supposed to be putting on a show for all these people at church. But then when they got home and, behind closed doors, they were allowed to do whatever they wanted. So she was only strict in public when people were able to see them. In December of 1914, Charles, Bonnie's father, died, and there's no record of why he died, but he passed away when she was younger, and this caused things to switch up for her mother, Emma, and the kids. So they were forced to move in with Emma's parents in Cement City. From here, her mother, Emma, who had never worked before, was forced to get a job, and she became a seamstress at a factory making overalls. And she made $9.50 a week, which at the time in 1914 was actually a pretty decent income, which is shocking, but inflation, So she was being a seamstress, she still had this attitude that her family was high class, and Bonnie kind of at this young age started having attitude problems. They called her the adorable terror. She would start fires and cause mayhem. She would also break into her grandfather's wine cabinet and drink until she passed out. So this is at a pretty young age when she was doing this. Actually, when she was 6 years old, she she went into school at Cement City School, and there she got into fights with classmates over very little things, like just like school supplies and things like that. And she would pick fights with them. She also learned during her time in school that she could use her charm to get attention from boys. So she starts picking up on the latest fashion trends, and she kind of becomes like her mother in that way. She likes to, look good in the public, and she likes being up to date on all the trends. She was always very glamorous, and actually, at the age of 15, she scraped together money to get her own glamour shots done. Because she believed that one day she would be famous. She became obsessed with this idea of becoming famous. And that could have also been due to the fact that, they had this life when her father was alive, of being this higher social class, and then that went away when he died. So now she feels she has to become famous because her family also needs the money. So just a few weeks before her 16th birthday, she married her high school boyfriend. His name was Roy Thornton. Um, Before they were even married, Bonnie got a tattoo of hearts and an arrow on of her and Roy's names on her inner thigh. And tattoos weren't very popular back then. They were actually quite scandalous. So the fact that she got it done before they were even married was quite scandalous. Um, on September 25th of 1925, they were married and they moved into an apartment. Bonnie, at first moving into the apartment, was excited, but then she started to miss her mom. So they ended up moving back in with her mom, Emma. Bonnie actually wanted kids, but according to that, there was her mother had written a memoir that actually never became a book. It just stayed as it's called like a screenplay, whatever before the book is called. But in there, she mentioned that Bonnie had a medical procedure done when she was younger, so she wasn't able to have children after that procedure, and that's why she didn't end up having kids later on, even though she really wanted them. On In August of 1924, her husband Roy, he started disappearing for days at a time and not telling Bonnie where he was. And he would come home drunk, and when she would ask him where he was, he would get angry and hit her. But she refused to divorce Roy because she really did love him. She had this sense of loyalty, even though he wasn't a good man to her. Even with Roy specifically, since they were married, she had a wedding band, and she wore that wedding band up until the end. Even after Roy ends up leaving her, she wears the wedding band even while she's with Clyde, and she had it on when she died. So she still wore the wedding band. And I don't know if that was a love for Roy or if that was just because she had that loyalty of believing that marriage was important. So in January of 1929, oh sorry, before this, Roy ended up leaving her. Like I mentioned, he leaves her for a woman named Reba. And then in January of 1929, he tries to come back to Bonnie, but she says no, because of how he treated her. And then just a few months after this, Roy gets arrested and is sentenced to 5 months in prison for robbery. So Roy was already kind of a bad guy, and she had a thing for the bad boys. So now, with no husband, Bonnie had to go and get a job. She became a waitress at a small cafe in Dallas, and her salary was $2 to $3 a week plus tips. And at this time, like a dime would be a decent tip. Like that would be a pretty sweet tip. I work as a bartender. If someone tipped me a dime, I would not be happy. But back in this time, it was acceptable. What's also ironic is that now that she was making $2 to $3 a week, I'm pretty sure servers make like $2 to $3 an hour. So that kind of still is around, even though inflation happened. But like I mentioned, so she took after her mom. She was always trying to look her best. She stayed classy. She got a lot of attention when she was working at the diner. It is possible, I read in a couple places, that it's possible that she went into sex work because this is also during the time that the Great Depression is creeping in, and making money became harder and harder. But she was really adamant about keeping her apartment, her stature, like all of these things going. So that's a possibility, but it wasn't completely confirmed. So while she's working at a cafe in Dallas, she meets a man named Ted Hinton. So Ted Hinton, later on, at the time when they met, he was a postman, but later he becomes a deputy, and he's actually recruited to be a deputy later on when Bonnie goes on her spree, specifically to help catch Bonnie and Clyde. So just that's where they met, was at this cafe in Dallas. And then later in 1930 is when Bonnie first meets Clyde at a party. So that's where I'll stop for Bonnie, and then I'm going to go into Clyde's story now. He has a very different upbringing. They came from two very different worlds. She started out pretty wealthy, her family was, and then they kind of went through a tragedy, and things kind of fizzled from there, and they had to pick it up on their own. His family kind of started from nothing. His full name was Clyde Bud Chestnut Barrow, and his parents were Henry and Connie Burroughs, and his father, from forever, had this reoccurring case of malaria, so he was sick a lot of the time, which made it difficult for him to work to supply for his family. So when him and his father and his mother met, Connie is his mother's name. She was raised in a very strict Christian household, and so strict that she would actually be beaten if her siblings did any kind of sin. Her parents also believed that makeup and wearing makeup was only things that prostitutes would do. So Connie wasn't allowed to do any of those things. She didn't have like the luxuries that a normal girl would have growing up. But she met Henry, Clyde's father, and they got together. And Clyde was born on March 24th, 1910. His family was very poor, and they had a farm at first, but then the Dust Bowl time happened in Texas, so their farm failed, and they moved their family to Dallas, Texas, which was the city at the time, to try to find better jobs. And a lot of people were doing this because farms were failing in Texas, so a lot of people were migrating into the cities. And so even though they were super poor, they migrated into the city, and they basically had to stay in the slums. It was a campground area that they stayed in, and at first they didn't even have a tent to sleep in. They actually slept under the wagon that they had rode in on, and like that's how they had to sleep with their kids and their parents, which was really sad. And Henry, their father, was trying to get, something for his family just to sleep in. And so he would collect scrap metal and sell it for money. And eventually he was able to save up enough to get a tent for his family. And then he would, buy and sell scrap metal or trade things, and eventually got wood and materials to build a small shack on the lot that they had there at the campground. Clyde attended school until the age of 16. He actually was pretty good at playing music. He played guitar and a saxophone. He also worked on his uncle's farm, and his mother got him to do that. One, because it gave him some money to work with as a family, but also two, she would send him to his uncle's farm to work because at least she'd know that they would get a free meal there, and that was important to have her kids eat. So that's kind of sad to think that she had to send her kids to work just because she wasn't able to feed them where she was. After working on the farm, he later moved into the city with his older brother, Buck. Now, Buck is an important character in the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Buck is basically the guy that introduced crime to Clyde. When he moved in with Buck had already started his life of crime, and was making money through cockfighting, and was also robbing banks kind of on the side, like working jobs with random people. So he starts to teach Clyde a few things about crime and robbing banks and all that stuff. On December 3rd, 1926, when Clyde was 17, he was arrested for car theft in Dallas. But this was his first arrest, but it was actually kind of a misunderstanding. He was arrested because he had rented a car to drive to another town to visit his girlfriend, but he kept the car longer than he was supposed to, and that's why they ended up arresting him. He actually, when they went to go get him, he was hiding in his girlfriend's attic at the time. And when they found him, arrested him, the company that he had borrowed the car from ended up dropping the charges once the car got returned. So he didn't do any time for that. The relationship that he had with that specific girlfriend didn't last much longer than that. They had tried to elope at one point, but they just ended the relationship after a point. Who knows why? But that wasn't the love of his life. That's probably why. So shortly after this, Buck had convinced Clyde to help him deliver turkeys. It was an odd job that he picked up. And so Clyde goes to do this job where they're transporting turkeys, and they actually end up getting pulled over and find out that the turkeys that they were transporting were stolen, and he's arrested again. So this is his second arrest. So for a life of crime, he kind of started out with very odd and kind of simple crimes. Because he had been arrested twice at this point, he starts to become, like a guy that police around town know, and this causes an issue for him. He really didn't like being known or like seen as a criminal because, obviously it's harder for him to do crimes if he's known as doing crimes. So it was difficult for him to find work, like regular work, because every time he would get a job, he would get police coming into his work and grabbing him for random crimes that were happening around town and interrogating him for them. So it was difficult for him to find work and keep work. And this kind of starts the feud that he has with the police. And we'll see how that goes later on too. So also a little bit about Buck, his older brother. In November of 1929, Buck meets Blanche Calloway. She was 18 and very pretty, and she wanted to make a life with Buck. Their story is kind of like the second love story of Bonnie and Clyde, and it's kind of not talked about as much, but it's actually really sweet. So Buck and Blanche is that story, and she comes back later, and you'll see why when they all become a little gang together. But and then in November 29th of 1929, Buck and a man named Sidney, they started doing odd jobs together. They stole a car together, and they robbed a house. Buck, Clyde, and this man, Sidney, they steal a car, rob a house, and on the way home, they stopped at a motor mart and broke in and stole the safe. Buck got shot in the leg, and Clyde got away because he ran and hid under a house. Buck gets sentenced to 4 years at this point, and so that's really sad for Blanche. Her man gets taken away. So this is kind of where Clyde also picks up on how good he is at getting away from police. This is the first instance of this happening, but later on there were times that they would be completely surrounded by cops and Clyde would still get away. So he was very slick in that. He was also a really good driver. He was a fast driver, and I'll kind of touch on that more later too. But then they meet. So in January 5th of 1930, Clyde finally meets Bonnie. He was 21 at the time, and she was 19. At this time, Bonnie was still technically married to Roy Thornton, like I mentioned, but he was in prison. And actually, Roy would later be killed during an attempted prison break, but that's not till 1937. So he stays in prison for quite some time. Also, during this time, Clyde decides, he doesn't have Buck anymore. He's in prison, but he decides he's going to go full criminal and just kind of commit to this life of crime because it was too difficult for him to try and get a regular job. On March 2nd of 1930, Clyde is arrested for burglary in Waco, Texas, and from here, he's sentenced to 14 years in prison. this is when he goes into his time in prison, which is very pivotal to kind of the gang later on. So at this time, it's in the 1930s. It's actually not too difficult to escape from prison. There was not any formal training when it came to police officers. A lot of them had other jobs and they were kind of volunteer police officers. They were actually paid commission. So if they were to like write a ticket, they would be paid a couple bucks, and that's how they made money as a police officer. So, and they actually had to provide their own guns and badge, and also they had to drive their own cars if you were a police officer. So there was a lot of like, I have authority, but they didn't really earn it, which is why they would fight a lot with everyday people. So while Clyde is in jail, his brother actually escapes from jail. Buck escapes from jail and it goes to hide out in Oklahoma. And Clyde doesn't know anything about this. But in 1930, Clyde ends up escaping prison with a gun that Bonnie had smuggled in for him. So she ended up being able to do this by there's a couple different stories about how she smuggled that gun in, but some of them say that she smuggled it in a certain way. I don't know how to explain that, but I think you can pick up on it. But what actually happened was she smuggled it in through a belt that was under her dress, and that's how she got the gun in for him, and then he got out. On March 18th of 1930, Clyde gets captured again in Milton, Ohio, after robbing a train station and getting lost on the back roads. This was actually kind of a funny story. What happened was Clyde and Bonnie robbed this train station and didn't know where they were going, so they took off in this car on the back roads in Ohio, and then we're like, oh, we don't know where we are. Let's turn around and go back where we started, and maybe we can figure it out from there. And they turn around and literally drive by the police that were at the scene of the robbery. So then they get caught. From this point on, whenever Clyde goes to rob banks, he always brings a map with him, and Bonnie became his little navigator. So she had the map and he would drive. When he's arrested here, Clyde goes to East End Prison Farm, which is where the most violent prisoners are taken. And they are forced to work on a farm all day. It's basically like free labor from these prisoners. And back then, prisoners were treated terribly, a lot worse than they are treated now. They were seen as property and kind of treated as slaves as well. So the prison guards would beat them, they would shoot them if they tried to escape. It was quite a miserable place, especially this farm specifically. And sometimes the prison inmates would even knowingly run to escape, knowing that they would be shot. So basically committing suicide in that way, just because they didn't want to stay there anymore. Clyde had been sentenced to 17 months there at that prison farm, and this really fueled the fire of the hatred that he already had for the law enforcement and government, stuff like that. So when he gets on the farm, he makes friends with this man named Ralph Foltz. They were on a bus together on the way to the farm, and Foltz had actually escaped that prison before, and that's why he had ended up back in there. And Clyde became good friends with Ralph, and he comes back around later too. Clyde had an issue with authorities, so he had been beaten many times while he was in prison there. He really was terrible at taking orders. That's also another reason he never got a real job. But when he's on this camp, there's a man there named Ed Crowder. And Ed Crowder had a job which was called a building tender. He was also an inmate, Ed was, but as a building tender, you were able to basically patrol other inmates. You had certain privileges that other inmates didn't have. He was able to beat up the inmates and keep them in order and bark orders at them and stuff like that, which Clyde did not like. He was kind of a monster, and he had been sentenced to 99 years at this prison farm, so he knew he wasn't ever getting out, which caused him to be pretty violent against the other prisoners. He actually would sodomize, rape, and beat all different prisoners, and Clyde also. So Clyde wants this guy Ed gone. he strikes a deal with another building tender named Aubrey Scally, who was doing a long time in prison as well. The deal was that Clyde would kill Ed Crowder, and Scally would take the fall for it since he was already doing a long time in prison. So on October 29th of 1931, Clyde takes a lead pipe from the field and hid it in his pants, and then lured Crowder into a shower and hit him over the head so hard that it took him down right away. And then Scally came in and stabbed both Ed Crowder and himself, so it looked like there was a scuffle, attempting to take the fall for Clyde. But what actually ended up happening is he didn't even have to do that because it was considered self-defense and he didn't end up getting any more years for it. But at least Ed Crowder, this evil man, is gone. And this was the first murder that Clyde committed. So in November of this time, while he's still in this prison, Bonnie actually stops writing to Clyde and she started seeing someone else on the outside. And this just makes Clyde want out even more. So he starts itching to get out of this place. He already hates it there, and now his girl's talking to someone else, and he can't do anything about it. So his brother Buck, like I mentioned, had escaped himself, and he actually goes and turns himself in on December 27th of 1931. He got pressure from Blanche to turn himself in, so he finally did. He just walked right in and turned himself in. So his brother's now back in jail. Clyde, I keep jumping back between Clyde and Buck, but it's because they kind of have the same story going up into when the gang is formed, so that's why it kind of tosses back and forth. But so Clyde at this point wants to get out of this prison, and his way of doing so, this idea that he comes up with, is that he's going to have a fellow inmate chop off his toe with an axe, thinking that by doing this he can get transferred to the medical prison and then eventually be transferred out of the farm that he was at. So this is his great idea, and he gets this other prison inmate to take an axe and chop off his toe. He ended up cutting off his big toe and part of the toe next to it. But what he didn't know was that his mother and Bonnie had actually been lobbying for his release and had convinced the governor to give Clyde parole. And he never even needed to cut off his toes, but he found that out a little too late because, he found out literally 6 days after he cut his toes off. He found out that he would have gotten out on parole without needing to do that. So from here, he walks around with a limp that he didn't need. So when he returns home to Bonnie, she ditches her boyfriend and they get back together right away because that's the love of her life, and like, screw that guy. So when Clyde is back, at first he does try to get jobs, but this is the 30s, it's the Great Depression, he has a criminal record, and he has a problem with authorities, so it's not going to work out for him that easily. He starts getting annoyed because every time he gets a job, police are still coming in to question him about random crimes that he has nothing to do with, but they still have their eyes on him. And he just starts getting angry. He's angry at life at this point and wants to go back to his life of crime because that's what he knows best. So around this time, his buddy Ralph Foltz, who he met in prison, eventually gets out, and all Ralph Foltz wants is revenge on this prison farm, East End prison farm that they were at, because of how terrible they were treated there. So he goes and finds Clyde and says, we got to get a group of guys together, we got to get money together, we got to get guns, we got to attack this East End prison farm and make them pay for the time that we spent there. At that point, Clyde was basically waiting for a reason to give up being a good citizen. So the second Ralph comes back, he's like, okay, great, at least I have a partner, let's go do this life of crime. And he wants to bring Bonnie along with him. So Bonnie ends up telling her mom that she got a job in another state. She lied to her mother, and she takes off with what would soon be the Barrow Gang. Their first robbery was actually a failure. It was with Clyde, Foltz, and another man named Hamilton, and they attempted to rob Sims Oil Refinery, thinking that there would only be one security guard there. There ended up being 4 security guards there, and it took a lot longer for them to tie them all up. And then when they finally broke into the safe, there was nothing in the safe to steal. It's the Great Depression, so it's a rough time to be trying to steal from anybody. This was all part of their plan, though, to get guns, to get guys to attack the farm. While looking for another bank to rob, they find one in Kansas, and Foltz and Clyde enter with their shotguns, and Hamilton was the getaway driver at this time. This was actually a successful bank robbery. They got $33,000 with this bank robbery, and this was actually the biggest score out of all the robberies that they had. So $33,000. I'm not sure what that would be now. I'm guessing it would be like in the millions, I think. So it's a lot of money, especially during this time where people need it the most. So Clyde was good at basically learning things when he needed to. He understood that when it came to robbing banks, it was important to know, the schedule of the guards. It was also important to have a fast car. He knew that having a fast car was the most important part because police had their own cars that they had to drive, and they weren't as fast as the ones that he could steal. So he would purposely steal the fastest cars he could find for getaway driving. Once they get this big break with the $33,000, their pal Hamilton decides he doesn't want to continue robbing banks with them because he's not really interested in breaking out the prison guys. So he leaves them, and it ends up being Foltz and Clyde, and then Bonnie starts coming in with them on their robberies. So Foltz tries to get other ex-cons together to join their prison gang, redemption gang. And so they attempt to do another bank robbery. In this bank robbery, they kidnap 2 police officers. And this is where Clyde first starts kidnapping the police officers. What's funny about this is when they started off taking police officers as hostage, they would actually drop them off. They didn't start by killing them. They would pick them up and kidnap them and then steal the money and then drive outside of town and just let them go. Sometimes they would even toss them like $5 and say sorry. And there's actually one story of Clyde giving a police officer a new shirt and tie because he messed his up when he was robbing them. So it started off nice with the police officers, and at first they weren't killing them. After this, like I mentioned, Bonnie starts becoming part of the crime. They use her because she's good with smooth talking. She's good at distracting. She's a very beautiful girl. I'm sorry, I didn't even PTR a picture of them. 1 second. Yeah, she's a very beautiful girl. She's good at distracting people. She's good at smooth talking people. And so they are able to use that to their advantage. So her first crime, I guess you could say, is when she pretends to be Scully's cousin. Scully, remember, was the guy that took the fall for killing the guy in prison. She goes back to East End Prison to talk to Scully, and basically she goes in to warn Scully, like, hey, the guys are coming for you, be ready, this is when they're coming for you. She really enjoys the thrill of that and gets kind of a high from it, and so she starts participating in more crimes from there. The 3 of them, Ralph, Clyde, and Bonnie, they steal cars in Kent, Texas, and she realizes pretty quickly that doing crime with Clyde isn't going to be easy, because when they steal these cars and they make a run for it, the car that they stole actually gets stuck in the mud, and the posse that was chasing them down for stealing these cars catches up to them, and Clyde makes a run for it, and that's the first time Bonnie gets arrested. But she ends up getting out because it was her first crime, and the guards kind of took pity on her, and they were like, oh, you were just doing it with the guys, whatever. So Clyde gets away, but his buddy Foltz didn't, and Foltz actually ended up going back to prison for that crime, for stealing those cars. So Clyde has to take it upon himself at this point to round up the guns and the guys. And sorry, my dog is being obnoxious. 1 second. So it's his job now to round up the guns and guys, and he's basically doing crime 24/7. He would be driving around to 11 different states. They would commit crimes in all these different states, and he would even be driving up to 11,000 miles a day, which is possible, but you barely sleep doing that. So Clyde was just running around doing these crimes with Bonnie, trying to collect the money and the guns to what the end game was for this prison. So, let's see. And also what's kind of ironic about this time is that because it was the Great Depression, 5,000 U.S. banks were closed during this time in 1932 alone. So a lot of the times they would show up to rob banks and the banks would be out of business, which is like completely put a wrench in their whole plan. But it was a struggle. Everyone was struggling at this point, and this is just how they were dealing with it, was through crime. So his brother, Buck, he ended up getting released from prison in March of 1933. He had been granted a full pardon by the governor, and he quickly joined up with Clyde and brought his wife Blanche along with them. So the group now had, the gang started a series of bold robberies, which made headlines across the country, which is probably what you might have seen, like the wanted posters. Even today, that you can buy posters that have the Bonnie and Clyde wanted posters on them. They were able to escape many encounters with the law, but that's kind of what made the law hate them even more and made the encounters with the law even more intense. There were a few different shootouts with Buck and Clyde that they were able to escape from. So it's actually kind of crazy that they made it as far as they did. But the Texas sheriff, actually not just Texas, many other states that knew of these people, they didn't like them, and they were all over the news, and they weren't able to catch him. So tensions were growing between Bonnie, Clyde, Buck, and law enforcement at this time. So in November 22nd, 1933, a trap was actually set in Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas sheriff and his deputies attempted to capture Bonnie and Clyde near Grand Prairie, Texas, but the couple escaped the officer's gunfire. They held up an attorney on the highway and took his car, which they abandoned in Miami, Oklahoma. And on December 21st, 1933, Bonnie and Clyde were held up again, and robbed a citizen in Shreveport. Sorry, this name is weird. Shreveport, Louisiana. Then their big plan to eventually get to the prison came to fruition on January 16th, 1934. 5 prisoners, including Raymond Hamilton, were liberated from Eastham State Prison farm because Clyde Burrow, accompanied by Bonnie, shot 2 guards and allowed the prisoners to escape. When they had, I'm sorry, my notes are a bit all over the place. So 2 guards were shot by the escaping prisoners with automatic pistols, which had been previously concealed in a ditch by Barrow. As the prisoners ran, Barrow covered their retreat with bursts of machine gun fire. Among the escapees were Henry Melvin of Louisiana. Now when I'm going to go into how they ended up being caught, and I'm actually going to read this straight from the FBI page because it gets pretty intense and I want to make sure it's accurate. So at this point, the FBI gets involved, and on April 1st of 1934, Bonnie and Clyde encountered two young highway patrolmen near Grapevine, Texas. Before the officers could draw their guns, they were shot. On April 6th, a constable at Miami, Oklahoma, fell mortally wounded by Bonnie and Clyde, and they were also abducted. They also abducted a police officer, whom they then wounded. Then they go on to continue more crime. On April 13th, 1934, an FBI agent, through investigation in the vicinity of Ruston, Louisiana, obtained information which definitely placed Bonnie and Clyde in a remote section southwest of that community. The home in which they were hiding out in was not far away from here, and they were able to kind of pinpoint where Bonnie and Clyde were from here. And then the following month, they put together a plan to catch Bonnie and Clyde. The FBI and local law authorities in Louisiana and Texas concentrated and apprehended and apprehended Bonnie and Clyde, who they strongly believed to be in the area. It was learned that Bonnie and Clyde, with some of the Melvins, had staged a party at Black Lake, Louisiana on the night of May 21st, 1934, and were due to return there 2 days later. So they knew they were coming back. And before dawn on May 23rd, 1934, a posse composed of police officers from Louisiana and Texas, including Texas Ranger Frank Hammer, concealed themselves in bushes along the highway near Sales, Louisiana. In the early daylight, Bonnie and Clyde appeared in an automobile, and when they attempted to drive away, the officers opened fire. Bonnie and Clyde were killed instantly together, and their car to this day is still on display at a museum. And I have a picture of that here. Oh, that's not, I can't see too much, but here, this one is the one of the car when it happened. There was a massive shootout, and they died together. And this was what eventually ended their life of crime. So in the movie, it's very dramatic. I'm guessing, obviously, this is still dramatic here. But this life of crime that they had was also composed of the gang, which was his brother and his brother's wife, Blanche. And once they got what they wanted, which was basically to have these prisoners escape from this prison that they hated, they just kind of kept on with the crime. So Bonnie and Clyde overall, they killed 13, or they are thought to have killed 13 people. Some of them, actually, most of them being police officers and cops, all during the time of the Great Depression, which was already difficult enough to get by. And so this is kind of, this tragic love story is what's gone down in history as being America's greatest love story. But really, I think Bonnie just had a thing for the bad boys, and she couldn't stay away, and Clyde couldn't get a job. So maybe I'm wrong for simplifying it like that, but that's kind of what it seemed like to me. Like they kind of kept on with the crimes, not because they were some bad boy and bad girl, but more so just because it was a tough time to try to get by any other way. If you're not robbing banks and you can't get a job, how were they really expected to live? So yeah, that's the story of Bonnie and Clyde. And I find so many things about it really ironic, like the thing about how he started out, and it was really simple crimes, and then he just all of a sudden was like, you know what, I'm committed to this. This is going to be my life from now on, as a life of crime. Bonnie wrote poetry, like I had mentioned, and through the poetry, she really glamorized this life of crime that they were on. She also, in the documentaries, I saw that she knew that he was going to go out this way, and she just wanted to die with him. So in a way, I think they both knew it was going to end this way, and it did. So they were both really young when they died, and it's a sad tale. But that's America's greatest love story, and to this day, it's still mentioned in so many songs and books, and like people aspire to be like, you know, ride or dies like Bonnie and Clyde. So it's cute, I guess, in that way, but it's still kind of funny that, I don't know, it's not as romantic as Romeo and Juliet or something like that, but it's real history, so that's what we get from it. But yeah, feel free to come up if you know the story of Bonnie and Clyde, if you want to just ask a question or chat about it. What's interesting is in the documentary I did watch, they had people that knew Bonnie and Clyde, like this isn't that long ago. But the documentary, I think, was done in the 90s, and they still had people there that knew them and could talk about what it was like to be in that time with them. So it's kind of wild to think that too. It wasn't that long ago that $9.50 a week was an acceptable pay. So inflation happens real quick. Yeah, so this is kind of a crazy time. If anyone wants to come up, or if you, I don't know, if you like this story, if you prefer the glamorized movie version, that's fine too. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi everyone.
How are you?
Good, I'm doing good. This is one of my favorite stories.
I hope I didn't like ruin it with how simple I put
it. No, you didn't at all. No, I done plenty of reports for school on this one, and every like what you were reading, that's the truth part of the story. I hate the way they died. I know that they at that time, because at that time they weren't also those popular type of robbers and criminals at that time, but the way that they died was horrific to me. I feel like I know that the police, and in everybody's mind, they were dangerous just because of how they would rob, but it was just the way they died. It was crazy.
Yeah. I think too, like what's funny about them is that when they started off in this and they got really big and on newspapers and stuff, the public really loved them, and that's why they had that, Bonnie kind of got her fame that she always wanted, but ironically Clyde didn't like being in the spotlight at all. So they got famous from this, and then over time, once they started killing the police officers and they started having victims, the public turned on them, and that's ironic too. It's like their own downfall. So it's I'm curious, like if they had survived that last run in, how much longer they could have gone on, or if they would have ended up breaking out of jail again. It's kind of like how much longer could have had gone on when at first the public was right behind them, like cheering them on because they were stealing from the rich and at such a hard time, and then it switched when they started actually killing people. So that's an interesting point too. Also, I found this point too, when they died, they actually had souvenir hunters come up.
Yes, that was so strange to me. Like I didn't realize Bonnie hand fell off, like just because how bad they were shot. Like that's why I was like, that was horrific the way where they were shot. But also too, if you know about Frank Hammond, he was one of the what do they call them, the Texas Rangers. So you kind of knew like that was the golden point to come and have him along with everybody else because they weren't going to get away this time. But the way they drove them through town like that, like I didn't understand that and how people was pulling on them.
Mm-hmm. It says they pumped more than 130 rounds of steel-jacketed bullets into the car and also into Bonnie and Clyde, and that once they were dead, the souvenir hunters tried to cut off parts of their body to sell because of how famous they had become at that point, which is like, how are they like, it's just so bizarre to me. It's obviously a different time, but how are souvenir hunters even getting access to their bodies? It's like, that's just creepy. But like, if you're that famous and people want a souvenir like that, like, ugh, it's crazy. Like, I can understand the car. I'd probably want the car because that's history. It's in a museum.
Right. But yeah, like, why the body? Who would want somebody's piece of their body? I understood the clothes or what they had on, but just that part always was just weird to me about the souvenir hunters.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if people still do that type of thing, souvenir hunting for. I mean, I know people collect some things, but like after someone has died, people like run up and try to collect things. I think that's crazy.
It's like a weird, like, I guess because they're so famous, people think that they don't get the same respect of like someone else. Like, that's the weird part to me. I guess because you can make money off of it, murderabilia and stuff, it's like the respect goes out the window and it becomes more about that. But like, it's kind of awful to think that they die this way and then people are chopping off their limbs to sell. Like, I don't know, what do you stuff it? Like, that's gonna go bad. I don't understand how that's done. Another fact that Bonnie also, she walked with a limp too because of a car accident she had been in. So Clyde had walked with a limp, and so did Bonnie. So they were kind of limping together. They were kind of a cute couple in that way.
Well, I thought too, like people who survived, like them being robbed, they would mention that, like they noticed that, being on the ground or when she would come up to them, how her leg would drag or how the drag was. Like they would mention hearing that or seeing that.
Yeah, it's an odd time. It's so hard to even put myself in that situation where not only are you being chased down by police, but the police that you're being chased down by aren't even like trained to be police. Like they're like they did have an FBI then. It was called like the Bureau. It wasn't called the FBI yet. I think it was called like Bureau something Bureau. And So I'm guessing they obviously were trained, but the everyday police officers that had to chase these people down and put their lives at risk to catch these robbers and stuff, it's just, I don't know what the motivation would be. So it must have just been a crazy time to catch people for crimes and then also keep them in jail because they would just escape. People were getting, they would just escape and then the boys would come back and get them out. And like, how do you even wrangle all those people?
The FBI to me kind of really formed when it was time to catch Dillinger. I feel like because with Babyface Nelson, nobody could catch him. You get what I'm saying? Like when you think about those people. So like with Bonnie and Clyde's time, that's why I feel like it was best for a Texas Ranger because they also didn't want the Texas Rangers to continue because how they said how it was awful for them to catch somebody that was a criminal because how they would kill them or things like that. So I just think at that time it took the FBI and certain people because a lot of people didn't like the person who created the FBI, so they didn't believe in that in the first place. But I feel like they came around more informed with John Dillinger's time.
Yeah, and it all kind of came out of that time of the Great Depression. So it's like the tensions are so high already, and then you have people, you have this Robin Hood mentality of Bonnie and Clyde, and you're rallying behind them in the office. Like, there's so much tension between the police and people just trying to survive and trying to live, and like not being able to find work. That's frustrating enough. So I'm shocked more robbers didn't come out. I mean, there's obviously mobs happening and gangs and stuff, but I'm shocked that it wasn't just pure chaos when it came to just robbing things, because they would show up to rob places and there would be no money in the safe because of the depression. So it's like, where do you even go to survive? Like, this time is such an interesting time in history, but it's also like not that far. It's not that far back. Like, and that's what's crazy to think. They literally were just robbing to survive and fighting with police on a day-to-day basis. It's like crazy. Police that weren't really trained police. Like, it's wild. But yeah. If there was ever a time that, like, obviously I wouldn't have wanted to live in that time, but like I would want to see it because like I feel like you could learn a lot from it just being in that time area. Or if you know any, well, actually, I'm trying to think. Would you? Oh yeah, there's people still around from that time. So yeah, if you know anyone, make sure to ask them questions because it's a fascinating piece of history that we even had to see, and thankfully we were able to get out of. So I know when I was listening to podcasts, they kept on comparing the Depression to like the 2008 crash. I was like, I don't feel like it was that extreme.
Yeah, no, me either.
Yeah, nothing was worse than that time. That's a horrific time the Depression was.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a fun case. I did it because it was Valentine's Day week. Well, Valentine's week, I guess, if you celebrate for a week. But I figured that was a good time to do the criminal couple of history. So yeah, if you want to come up and chat about it, or if you learned something, or if I took away the drama of it. I know the movie is so much better, like how they meet in the movie, like when he's just like, "You're gonna rob this, like, will you rob it?" And she's like, "Oh yeah," and it's like sparks flying everywhere. It's a lot more glamorized, and they also a couple different characters in the movie were real life characters, but they were multiple characters kind of pushed into one person. The gentleman CW in the movie, where did I write that? Trying to find that bullet point. CW Moss in the movie was two different people in real life. W.G. Jones, which was someone that accompanied them in their gang, and then later on, Henry Methan was the other person that C.W. Moss in the movie was based off of. So, yeah, they did that. They kind of, what you have to do in movies, obviously. Actually, while researching this, I found a really cool podcast that is called, where is it? Based on a true story. What he does in the podcast is he like watches movies, and then he has historians come in and like go scene by scene and say what's accurate about the scene and how far off the scene is. So that was kind of a cool podcast to listen to. Yeah, a lot of cool facts in there. But yeah, Bonnie and Clyde, what a ride. And they were young when they died too. It's like, it's sad. They were kids. But
How
also,
old were they again?
Let's see. They were born in 1910, and then they died in 1934, so 24. So yeah, pretty young.
The Highwaysman was my favorite movie. That basically, even though it was about their death, that was my particular more movie about Bonnie and Clyde versus. It is one Bonnie and Clyde movie I do like. I can't name the characters, but I feel like it was a better story version line. But when it comes to the movies, I don't know. I just don't particularly go for all of them because you do get the different stories that give different concepts of why people think this really happened versus what was true or fact.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes sense. Like, I mean, they became such a like, what's the right word? Such like the picture of the struggle of what was happening in America, but also like these, they were famous for what they were doing, the bank robberies and stuff. So if that's what we have from history, they're going to glamorize it, especially when they're doing movies of it. So it makes sense. But yeah. If anyone wants to come up and chat about it, or I can move on to what's happening next week. I have a big one for next week, so I didn't even tell Danielle what I'm doing next week. It's a big one. Oh, hey, Dave.
Hey, how are you guys doing? Thanks for the room.
Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to say something real quick about the depression. Like, before my wife's grandma died, I used to talk to her about the depression. And also, my dad and mom, I'm 60, and my dad and mom are still alive, so they were little kids during the depression. And just stories about how people would like make do, like they would, if they wore sheets out, like they have a hole in the middle, they would cut them and then re-sew them together, like flip it around so the hole would be on the outside. You kind of know what I mean? I mean, just little stories like that were just fascinating. Like, we would take collars of shirts and like flip them around. And my dad, to this day, I don't talk to him too much about it, but both my dad and my mom grew up in rural Kentucky and they were poor. And then also my dad grew up in Chicago and there were 5 kids. My mom's family, 8 kids. But they both have stories of where there'd be no food. So then like if people down the road had food, they would share. And then when they had food, they would share. And, to this day, the reason why I don't talk about it too much with my dad is it will still bring him to tears about how they didn't have food. And, sometimes, my grandma would go down the road and she'd come back with like 2 potatoes and then she would like make potato soup. which would basically be like water almost, to feed the whole family. So it's like it was really tough times. So I just wanted to give some context to what you were saying about how people really struggled.
Yeah.
So anyway, but yeah, it is, even though they're criminals and stuff, it is kind of a sad story, and especially how they were going down in the end, So anyway,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that. So hope that wasn't too much of a downer, but I just wanted to give some context. I mean, I've always been fascinated how, like, I wonder, how we wonder, like, how people become criminals and stuff like that. But I wonder how it would be if you really went through times that tough. Like, how would you act? Like we were saying, it's surprised that more people didn't get robbed or turn to crime or whatever. Like, how would you act if times were that tough? It's really interesting. So anyway, I'll be quiet now. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's why people were so into them and like the memorabilia part of it, because they were kind of just doing what everyone else wanted to do. Like, I'm sure a lot more people would have loved to just go on the run and rob banks because they just wanted food. They just wanted to survive. So yeah, I definitely see why people saw them as celebrities instead of seeing them as criminals. But it kind of switched when they started killing the police officers. But it makes sense. Like, they're getting away with like just what you're trying to do. So yeah, it's a terrible time. But
Yeah, they were kind of, I guess people were like, good, they're sticking it to the man or whatever. I think I might have cut out there. They're kind of like now, how we've got really, really rich people and then a lot of people that are struggling. So that's one of the reasons why we have the political climate we have in this country. But I won't get started on that. So anyway,
that's a whole different topic. But yeah, it's interesting when we think about, because I know when COVID happened, everyone was like, we were all struggling, and then compare that to what they were going through. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Not a lot of people, or at least the next 20, 30 years will be around that would live through that. But so when they went through COVID, it was different. They were like, this is a piece of cake. But for us, it was
I know people were freaking out here. Could you imagine the people today being caught back in the depression? They wouldn't survive.
No, not at all. They would just be like vlogging the whole thing. Completely. Well, yeah. So yeah, that's Bonnie and Clyde. And oh, hi Lala.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Thank you for doing this. I know of this story generally speaking, but I did not really have as much detail about the happenings of Bonnie and Clyde. I did, however, I thought it was not, I wouldn't say fascinating, but I definitely kept focusing more on the police, like the behavior and the prisons, and kept thinking to myself, not much has changed in a weird way, because what was it that you were explaining of the training and kind of how the treatment of the cops would be. I just kept thinking to myself, well, they're trained better-ish, but they're still not trained like they need to be, and it continues to show itself through similar actions that even Bonnie and Clyde endured then today with many people.
Right. Yeah, it's like and there's still probably towns where like you can't find people that want to be a police officer, so you kind of just have those volunteer sheriffs that aren't properly trained. They don't really know what to do if there ever was a murder. Like that happens a lot with cases where like it happens in a small town where they're not used to with the proper protocol, and then evidence is all messed up. So yeah, it does still happen when they're not properly trained.
And I also think it's it's still true in some small towns that type of farm slave labor type thing still does happen to a lighter degree, if that can be said.
Yeah, you mean like with the prisoners?
Yes, with prisoners. Yeah, and I just, not much has changed. I just thought that was really strange because although the treatment is kind of better, but in prisons it's still a power complex that happens all the time with the guards and the people who run the prison versus the people who are actually there. And so that type of wanting to have a vendetta against the institution, that hasn't changed either.
Yeah. I mean, like, that's crazy too. Like, you would think that at this point in history is where they would try to learn the most. Instead, they just seem to still carry on with the same mistakes.
Yeah, but I think it also speaks to the undervaluing of humans that make less and that have less.
Yeah.
And that to me seemed to be the bigger overencompassing story of the whole thing, because like it was explained, that was a very traumatic and sad time for everyone. The banks didn't even have money to be robbed. Like, it's like there was still so much empathy lacking from the government for the people that it's supposed to serve. Very disappointing.
And that's the other point too. Like, I mean, there's a few times where Clyde tries to become a good citizen and go and get a job, and he keeps getting hounded by police. They won't leave him alone. Like, it's just like that just builds the tension even more. If they had left him alone, and maybe he could have tried a different life route than doing the crime, but he just felt like there's nothing else he could do at that point. That's what he had already. He was young too. Like, he had time to change it, but instead it was like he couldn't get past a job just because they were hounding him all the time. And they just, once they had it in their mind that that's who he was, that's who he's always going to be. And the same with with the other guys in the gang, the West Dallas gang that they all put together. Like, they kept going in and out of prison too because that's all they knew, and they just end up stuck in it. So that's a whole other room on prison reform. But that's like it just seems like, yeah, what else were they expected to do at that point?
Deserve it. I'm really glad you did this, because it puts a lot more into perspective of the time. And because you said it's not that far away, which is so insane. Because I'm definitely going to ask my grandmother the next time we talk. So, do you remember when?
I remember that during COVID. Like, my grandma was like, "This isn't even that bad. Like, we get to stay home. This is fine." Like, at least like the supermarket isn't it. Well, I guess the first half of it was kind of empty, but she wasn't freaking out at all. Like, it seemed like the young people were the ones freaking out the most because we just didn't know what to expect. And they went through this, what was it? The Great Depression lasted, 10, 15 years before it actually started coming back. So that's way longer than 2 years of COVID. Hi, Janae.
Hi, how are you guys?
Good.
Good. I have kind of a weird question, and I've been trying to Google it to see if I can find anything. Do we know if either of their parents came out and said anything after they were killed? Because like you guys said, they were so young. I would like to think, I know it was a different time, but I would like to think their parents were still alive, or at least like one of their parents.
Yeah. There was a manuscript that Bonnie's mother had written.
Oh, right. You did say that. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if Clyde's parents ever tried to put anything together. I know that his brother died in a shootout. His brother Buck did. And so he wasn't able to tell any stories, but I know about the manuscript. It wasn't ever turned into, that's the word I was looking for. It wasn't ever turned into a book because she didn't get to finish it before she died. But so far, that was like the one I was able to find. I'm sure like other people that had run-ins with them and stuff wrote about it. In the documentary, they interview I believe it was Bonnie's sister, maybe, or it was her sister, or maybe her aunt. Not her aunt. I'm not sure who they had a woman there that was related to Bonnie directly that spoke about what it was like to be around them. But I don't think she wrote a book. But yeah, that was kind of, and it seems like they kind of went off what the media wrote about them and not so much what people were saying about them, which is funny because like the media was the one that was glamorizing them, and that's where the whole love story took place. I mean, people love a good love story, and that's kind of what's ironic about it, is that it's, people wanted a break from their reality, and Bonnie and Clyde were over here fighting a good fight and robbing banks. So that must have just been fun to read. But yeah, I'm not sure about other than her mother who might have tried to write a book or anything for him. There's lots of historians that are just like specifically historians about Bonnie and Clyde, which is crazy. The stuff that I mentioned, like, is just bullet points. They can go on and on. I was going to go into detail about all the different murders that they actually carried out, but when I tried to do that, they all got convoluted. They all got kind of like jumbled. There was not really a good set of this happened this date, and these are the victims. Instead, it was just like they robbed this bank, they robbed this. Like, it was all kind of chaotic. I told one of my friends in a room last night, I was like, I should do the whole room like Bonnie and Clyde from the 1930s and see if anyone notices and do that voice. But I didn't end up doing that.
That does make me even more curious about their transition to murder, because I think it takes a lot to get to that point, especially because they seem to be robbing out of survival, not out of true malice.
Yeah.
So I really wish like there was a fly on the wall that could really break down what that ascension into this next level of criminal was for them.
Yeah, to me, I felt like Bonnie was a mastermind, regardless to what type of family she came from, and even though like Clyde and the other gentleman did, certain things, I feel like she was the one because she loved it. Like, it made her feel a great type of way. So I feel like it was her who kind of pushed like the murder, or murdering people or hurting people when they would rob.
Yeah. That's I saw that a couple places too, that Bonnie was the one because she was like the thrill seeker, and Clyde was just good at what he did. He was like, well, I'm not getting a job anywhere else. I might as well rob banks because I know how to drive a car fast and I know how to get away. Where Bonnie was like really into the thrilling part of it. So there was a little debate about like who was the front runner and all of that, which kind of that happened. The other case I covered where like the girl was actually the one calling the shots, and it was the Christmas killings one, where it seemed like the girl was the one calling the shots, and the guy was the one that actually got the most time for it. So sometimes that happens. Like, I mean, girls can be slick. They know how to maneuver their way out of things, and people usually feel bad for them a lot more often than you feel bad for the guy. So that could be part of it.
Yeah, and then also the fact that she was more glamorized in the media, and that it probably went to her head in such a way. I mean, I would have loved, because I also think to myself, where were her girlfriends? Did she not have any girlfriends?
Right. Stay away from him.
Right, like nobody was kikiing and talking about this hot mess and making you reconsider, or at least try to reconsider.
Well, her mom didn't like Clyde, and she actually wanted Bonnie to stay with the boyfriend that she was with when Clyde was locked up, but like, screw that.
Yeah, mom was not for it at all about Clyde. She did not like him.
Which is sad too. Like, her mom was like, her mom lost her husband, and then she loses her daughter in this way just because her daughter wanted a life of crime with her mans. It's like, no one wants to see your daughter go out like that. You can't stop it. You can't stop the love.
Can you imagine the funeral? Have any of you guys heard anything about what the funerals were like?
I know that they're buried close to each other, but I don't know about the funerals.
You just see the pictures of the bodies. You just know where they're buried, but it's more pictures of like their bodies versus them having a service or a funeral.
Oh
wow! Because I would wonder if like people came out by the masses for these people just because, not even like in true celebration, but sometimes people, they just show up even when there's executions. Like people pile outside of prisons just to get word that it happened, not even to see.
they're not. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I was just reading somewhere that someone offered Clyde's parents $50,000 to mummify his body and make it part of a traveling show.
Oh, that's gross.
That's really weird. Now, granted, I did go see the mummies in the Smithsonian, but I felt like that was different.
Yeah, but those are like actual mummies, right? Like they're
right. It was culturally performed
as
something that they did all the time, not just
murder.
I was about to say for decoration. Oh my god, that's so weird.
No, but I don't like it. That is, it's to make money. They're doing it to make money, but like, why to see someone's body just to be in the presence of it? Is that supposed to be like what you're paying tickets for? Like, I would be creeped out. That thing's gonna be haunted.
Yeah.
So this is what I read about the funerals. This is what I found about the funerals. It says that they were put on display at in 2 different places. Around 10,000 people came by to look at Clyde, while 20,000 people wanted to see Bonnie. Their funerals were much smaller, a couple of hundred people each, but only because there were lots of armed guards. Bonnie and Clyde asked to be buried next to each other, but Bonnie's mother wouldn't hear of it. They were laid to rest in Dallas cemeteries a couple miles apart.
Damn.
Wow.
So they went out together, but they weren't able to rest together.
And the armed guards at the funeral, like, that had to be, then that means the life after their death for the families had to be somewhat exhausting just because of the aftermath and the fallout of people being upset, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I think that's also good on her her mother, because like her mother, when I was reading about her, they said that she was like Bonnie in the fact that she liked the spotlight, she liked being known, she kind of liked the attention in that way. She could have just as easily let them be put together and gotten that like extra publicity and all that drama from it, but she probably felt like, you took my daughter away, you don't get to be buried with her. So good on her.
I am looking, I don't know why I looked this up, at the pictures of their bodies, and like, I feel so nauseous. Why do we have so much access to all of these pictures? Like, I just looked at a close-up of her hand. Like her injured hand. I didn't realize that there were pictures like this just out for us to see, because I've never thought about looking it up. It's really sad.
I wonder if that means that, because when there's high profile like murders or deaths, there's always like this scare, I'm using air quotes, that somebody's going to sneak into the autopsy room and take pictures, right? I wonder if that happened to them, to get, or even if the doctor that completed the autopsy might have, because I wouldn't put it past them in that time, if that makes sense, if they could sell the picture for money.
And in some of them, there are, I don't know if it's like doctors or agents from whatever the FBI was called at the time, but there are definitely, like, I want to say 7 to 8 people in the background of these photos, on some of them. So, and they're in suits, like they're well dressed.
But at that time, like anybody who like died like that, like them or the other robbers, everybody has a picture of their death. All bodies are shown. They show the public. It was kind of like making an example. They thought, even though all those people are there, because I had that question, like, how come everybody like Dillinger or Pretty Boy Floyd, they all have a death picture and their bodies are displayed?
Mm.
Wow, I didn't think of it like that.
That's interesting. Like, I wonder when like censoring, came in and it was no longer, because if they were just put out there like this before, and then at some point it became like not good practice to display pictures like this of dead bodies. Like, I wonder when that came, what era that came in, and it became not okay. I doubt these pictures. Maybe these pictures were in the newspapers, but like that would be shocking if a kid came across a picture like this. Like, I'm looking at the pictures too. Like, these are gruesome pictures.
They really are. I guess, like Jennifer said, I guess I wasn't thinking about it like being a different time and of them putting the pictures out to kind of make an example of criminals. It makes sense, but like you just said, I couldn't imagine like a child picking up a newspaper or just happening to see one and these bodies being on the front page.
Yeah.
I posted a link. I tried to get one that didn't have so many of the gory pictures, but this was just some that had some more photos of them. But there is one gruesome one in there if y'all, if you don't want to see it.
Yeah. Also, like, the wanted pictures were so interesting. They would like flat out like they would put on like full paragraphs of descriptions. I guess because they were put in newspapers, so people would be reading them, so that makes sense. But like, I'm thinking more like nowadays, they just put the name, the height, like what they look like, and that's like all you get.
Every single story doesn't.
Yeah. Oof. It's a sad tale, but also they were murderers, so
That part.
Yeah, you can't forget that part. But yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up with this one, and I'm gonna let you go. But yeah, thanks everyone that came up on stage and everyone that hung out in the audience. I hope you enjoyed this one. It's an old one, but it's a good one, and we learned a lot. I learned a ton, and it's just a good thing to remember in history. A good time to remember in history. So thanks everyone for coming, and then also make sure to follow the club, True Crime Talks. Bye guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.